The invitation arrived on a quiet afternoon when she least expected anything special to happen. The house was still, with soft sunlight coming through the window and dust particles floating gently in the air. She was sitting near a small table, going through some old music sheets she had kept for years. They were worn out, edges slightly folded, but she still treated them carefully, like they carried memories she could not let go of. Her life had always been simple. She was not someone who chased attention or tried to stand out in crowded places. Most people who knew her would describe her as calm, polite, and reserved. She worked quietly, helped where she could, and spent most of her time either at home or practicing music when she felt like it. Music was not just a skill for her. It was something she carried deep within herself, something that gave her peace when words were not enough. That afternoon, when the envelope was placed in her hands, she did not think much of it at first. It looked official, with a clean seal and neat handwriting. She opened it slowly, expecting something ordinary, maybe a notice or a simple request. But as she read the contents, her expression changed slightly. She had been invited to perform at a formal gathering in the city. It was not a small event. It was organized by people who hosted performances, cultural evenings, and musical showcases that usually attracted respected guests and known personalities. She read the letter twice, trying to understand why her name was there. She was not widely known. She had never performed on a grand stage before. Most of her playing had been in quiet spaces, small rooms, or occasional community gatherings where the audience was limited. Yet, the invitation clearly mentioned her name. It also mentioned the expectation that she would perform a simple piano tune as part of the evening program. For a moment, she just sat there, holding the letter without moving. There was no excitement on her face, only a calm curiosity. She was not the type to jump to conclusions. Instead, she carefully thought about it. Perhaps they needed someone to fill a small segment. Perhaps someone else had recommended her without making a big deal out of it. Whatever the reason, she did not feel the need to question it too much. Later that day, she decided to accept the invitation. Not because she felt pressure, but because music had always been a part of her life, and refusing would not make sense to her. She did not see it as an opportunity to prove anything. For her, it was simply another moment where she could sit in front of a piano and let her fingers speak. As the day of the event approached, she continued her routine as usual. She did not change her habits or try to prepare in an unusual way. Instead, she practiced quietly, focusing on control and expression rather than complexity. The piece mentioned in the invitation was simple, something almost every pianist could play without difficulty. But even in simplicity, she believed there was room for feeling, for depth that could not be measured by difficulty alone. On the day of the performance, she arrived at the venue a little earlier than required. The building was large and well decorated, with soft lighting and polished floors that reflected the glow from elegant chandeliers. People moved around in formal clothing, talking in groups, greeting each other, and preparing for the evening ahead. There was a sense of importance in the air, like everything had been carefully planned to impress. She walked in quietly, carrying herself with calm confidence. No one paid much attention to her at first. She was just another performer in a long list of guests scheduled for the night. She noticed how others were being greeted warmly, introduced with respect, and guided carefully. In contrast, she was simply directed toward a waiting area near the side of the stage. The waiting area was quiet. From there, she could hear faint sounds of music, people rehearsing, and soft conversations from behind the curtains. She sat down, placing her hands gently on her lap. Her expression remained steady, but her mind was observant. She watched everything carefully, not out of nervousness, but out of awareness. At one point, a staff member walked by and briefly glanced at her. There was a polite but indifferent look, as if she was not particularly significant in the lineup. Another performer nearby was discussing their piece with confidence, talking about difficult passages and dramatic moments. She listened quietly but did not react. She never felt the need to compare herself with others. As time passed, she remained in the same place, calm and composed. The piano performance she was scheduled for was not until later in the program. According to the schedule, it was meant to be a short, simple piece placed between more elaborate acts. It was not meant to be the highlight of the evening. It was meant to fill a gap, something light and easy for the audience to enjoy without much attention. Still, she did not feel disappointed. She understood her role as it was presented to her. She had no expectations beyond what had been written in the invitation. For her, music was not about position or recognition. It was about the moment itself, the connection between emotion and sound. As she waited, she closed her eyes briefly and recalled the first time she ever touched a piano. It had been years ago, in a quiet room with sunlight coming through a small window. She remembered how each note had felt alive, how each sound carried meaning even when no one else was listening. That memory brought a slight sense of peace to her mind. Eventually, a soft announcement echoed through the backstage area, signaling that her turn would come soon. She opened her eyes slowly, adjusting her posture. There was no rush in her movements, no visible tension. She simply stood up when it was time and made her way toward the stage entrance. As she walked, she could hear the applause from the previous performance fading away. The atmosphere ahead felt different, heavier, filled with anticipation. She did not let it affect her. Her focus remained steady, centered on what she was about to do. Just before stepping onto the stage, she paused for a brief moment. The piano was waiting under soft lighting, positioned in the center where all eyes would eventually turn. From behind the curtain, she could see only a portion of the audience. They were still settling, talking softly, unaware of what was about to happen in the next few minutes. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the curtain, took a calm breath, and prepared herself, not for a performance meant to impress, but for a moment that belonged entirely to music. And then, with steady steps, she moved forward toward the stage. She stepped through the curtain and felt the quiet change in the air immediately. The sound from behind her faded, replaced by a soft hush from the audience in front. It was not complete silence, but it felt heavy in a way that made every small movement noticeable. The stage lights were warm but bright, pointing directly toward the center where a grand piano stood waiting. For a brief moment, she did not move. She simply stood at the edge of the stage, letting her eyes adjust to the space. The hall was larger than it had looked from backstage. Rows upon rows of seats stretched into the distance, filled with people dressed neatly, sitting in relaxed but expectant postures. Some were still finishing their conversations. Others were already looking toward the stage with mild curiosity. She noticed something quickly. Most of the attention in the room was not fully on her yet. The audience seemed to be in that in-between state where they were waiting for something more important later in the program. To them, this was just another small performance in a long evening. A short musical piece, nothing more. She walked forward slowly, her steps steady and quiet. There was no hesitation in her movement, but there was also no attempt to draw attention. She simply moved as someone who belonged there, even if others had not yet realized it. As she approached the piano, she could feel the subtle weight of expectation. It was not spoken, but it existed in the room. People assumed they already knew what was coming. A simple tune, soft background music, something pleasant but forgettable. That was the unspoken belief shared by many in the audience. She reached the piano bench and paused again. Her fingers hovered slightly above the seat before she gently sat down. The bench was smooth and firm beneath her, and the piano in front of her looked polished under the stage lights. Its black surface reflected faint shapes of the room, distorted but elegant. From where she sat, she could now see the audience more clearly. Faces were calm, some distracted, some mildly interested. A few people leaned back in their chairs as if preparing for a short moment of background music before the next highlight of the evening. No one seemed to expect anything unusual. Behind her, the curtain closed fully. The stage was now hers, even if only for a short time. She placed her hands lightly on the keys without pressing them yet. Her fingers rested there calmly, as if she was listening before playing. This was her habit. She always gave herself a small moment of silence before beginning, not for preparation, but for understanding the space she was in. In that silence, she noticed something else. The room had its own rhythm. The faint movement of people shifting in their seats, the soft sound of programs being adjusted, the distant echo of someone coughing lightly. All of it formed a quiet background that most people would ignore. But she heard it differently. To her, it all felt like part of the moment. A soft introduction was announced, briefly mentioning her name and the upcoming piece. The words were polite but simple, without much emphasis. It was clear that this performance was not being presented as something major, just a short piano tune as expected. She did not react to the introduction. She never relied on how others described her performance. Instead, she focused inwardly, letting her thoughts settle. Her hands shifted slightly on the keys, still not playing, just feeling the position, the distance, the weight of each finger ready to move. In the audience, a few people turned their attention more directly toward the stage. Some leaned forward slightly, ready to listen. Others remained relaxed, expecting nothing more than soft background music. There was no tension in the room, only mild anticipation. She took a quiet breath, and then she began. The first note was soft, almost delicate. It did not demand attention. It simply appeared in the space like a small drop of sound falling into still water. The tone was simple, clear, and gentle. A few people in the audience barely noticed at first. It blended into the atmosphere without disturbing it. The melody followed in the same direction, calm and steady. It was exactly what had been expected. The piece was familiar in structure, easy to recognize, easy to follow. Nothing complex, nothing that required deep focus. For the audience, it confirmed their assumptions. Just a simple performance, nothing more. She continued playing with steady hands. Her expression remained calm. There was no visible effort, no dramatic movement. Her body stayed still except for her fingers, which moved with quiet control across the keys. Some people began to relax further. A few glanced away, checking their phones or whispering softly to each other. The performance was pleasant, but not something that demanded full attention. It served its purpose as expected. However, something subtle began to shift. It was not sudden. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. The way she played began to change in tone. Not in speed or volume, but in feeling. The same simple notes started to carry a deeper sense of flow, as if the music was gently opening up. Her hands moved with slightly more intention. The melody remained simple, but the emotion behind it started to grow. It was no longer just a basic tune. It was becoming something warmer, something more connected. A few people in the audience slowly looked back toward the stage. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something about the sound felt different. It was still soft, still simple, but it had gained a kind of presence that was hard to ignore. She did not change her posture. She did not look at the audience. Her focus stayed entirely on the piano. For her, the music was not about reaction. It was about expression. The notes continued, flowing smoothly from one to the next. The simple structure of the piece was still there, but it felt like it was being shaped from within. Each repetition carried slightly more depth than the last. In the hall, attention slowly began to shift. Conversations faded without people realizing it. Movements slowed. More eyes turned toward the stage. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual pull, like the room itself was adjusting to the sound. Still, no one fully understood what was happening yet. To them, it was still just a simple piano performance. But the way she played suggested something else was quietly forming beneath the surface. The music continued to flow through the hall, still soft, still simple on the surface, but something had already begun to change in the way people were listening. What started as casual attention was slowly turning into curiosity. The audience that had once been relaxed and distracted was now becoming quietly focused without even realizing it. She remained seated at the piano, her posture calm and steady. There was no visible effort in her expression, no tension in her shoulders, no rush in her movements. Her hands moved as if they already understood the path they needed to follow. Every note came naturally, like it had been waiting to be released rather than created in the moment. Backstage, where she had stood only minutes before, the atmosphere was still normal. People there were busy with their own tasks, adjusting schedules, preparing for the next acts, speaking in low voices. To them, her performance was still just a short segment in the middle of a long program. Nothing important, nothing that needed special attention. But on the stage, something subtle was building. The melody, still based on a simple structure, began to feel richer. It was not louder. It was not faster. It was something more delicate than that. The way she shaped each note gave it meaning that went beyond its simplicity. It was as if the same few sounds were now carrying deeper emotion without changing their form. In the audience, a few people shifted in their seats. At first, it was small changes. Someone who had been leaning back now sat a little straighter. Another person who had been looking away turned their head back toward the stage. These were not dramatic reactions, but they were signs that something was beginning to hold attention. She did not look up. She never did. Her eyes remained focused on the keys, as if the world beyond them had temporarily faded. For her, this was not about being seen. It was about the connection between thought, feeling, and sound. The piano responded to her touch with clarity. Each note seemed to carry a different weight, even though the composition itself remained simple. It was this balance that made the sound quietly powerful. Nothing was forced. Everything flowed naturally. A soft silence began to grow in the room. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. Conversations stopped completely now. Even the small movements that usually fill a hall like this were fading. People were starting to listen without realizing they had chosen to. In the middle rows, a few faces showed slight confusion. They were not sure why they were suddenly paying more attention than expected. After all, this was supposed to be a simple piece. Something easy, something light. But the feeling in the room no longer matched that expectation. She continued playing. Her hands moved with steady confidence, never rushing, never pausing. The rhythm remained smooth, but there was now a growing sense of direction within it. It was no longer just a repetition of notes. It felt like a journey that was slowly unfolding. In the quieter corners of the hall, people began to notice something they could not easily explain. The music felt emotional without being loud. It felt deep without being complex. It was simple, yet it carried weight. A man in the audience leaned slightly forward, his attention fully drawn now. A woman nearby stopped adjusting her program sheet and slowly lowered it to her lap. Even those who had not been interested before were now watching the stage more carefully. She remained unchanged in appearance. There was no dramatic expression on her face. No visible sign that she was aware of the shift happening in the room. She simply continued playing, as if she had entered a space where only the piano and her thoughts existed. Backstage, one of the staff members paused briefly, hearing the sound more clearly now. They glanced toward the stage opening, slightly surprised by the tone of the music. It was still the same performance, but it no longer sounded like something minor. On stage, the melody began to gently expand. Still simple in structure, but now shaped with more emotion. The transitions between notes felt smoother, more connected. It was as if the music was breathing. In the audience, attention had fully shifted. People were no longer casually watching. They were listening. Some leaned forward. Some sat completely still. Even those who had not planned to pay attention were now fully drawn in. But still, no one spoke. There was a shared silence forming in the hall, not enforced, but naturally created by the sound itself. She continued. Her fingers moved with quiet precision. Every motion was controlled but not mechanical. There was warmth in the way she played, even though she never showed emotion outwardly. It was carried entirely through the music. The simple tune that had begun moments ago was no longer perceived as simple. It had evolved in the minds of the listeners. Without realizing it, they were now experiencing it differently. What was once background sound had become the center of attention. A slight shift occurred in the lighting reflection on the piano as her hands moved faster for a brief moment, then slowed again. It was not a change meant to impress. It was part of the natural flow she followed, guided by feeling rather than structure alone. The audience remained silent, but their focus deepened. Some people had their eyes fixed on her hands. Others closed their eyes, simply listening. Each person was experiencing the moment in their own way, but all of them were connected by the same sound. She was still unaware of the growing impact in the room. Or perhaps she was aware, but it did not change her approach. She did not play for reaction. She played because the music existed within her at that moment. The piece continued to evolve quietly, moving forward without breaking its simplicity. And yet, something about it had already begun to change the atmosphere of the entire hall. The hall had changed now, even if no one could clearly explain when it happened. What started as a simple piano performance had slowly turned into something that held every person in place. The soft sounds coming from the stage were no longer treated as background music. They had become the center of attention without anyone deciding it consciously. She continued to sit at the piano, still calm, still steady. Her expression had not changed since the first note. There was no sign of effort or pressure on her face. She did not look at the audience, and she did not react to their silence. Her focus stayed completely on the keys in front of her, as if the rest of the world no longer mattered. The melody she was playing had now taken on a deeper shape. It was still built from the same simple structure, but the feeling behind it had grown stronger. The notes were no longer just notes. They were carrying something that felt personal, something that reached beyond sound alone. In the audience, people were now fully still. No more shifting in seats. No more distracted glances. Even those who had not been interested earlier were now completely focused. It was as if the room had agreed, without words, to listen. A few faces showed quiet surprise. Not loud shock, not dramatic reactions, but a slow realization that something about this performance was different. It was not about speed or complexity. It was about emotion, control, and the way each sound seemed to naturally belong exactly where it was placed. She played on. Her hands moved gently but with confidence. Every movement felt natural, like the piano keys were responding to her thoughts rather than her fingers. There was no hesitation, no interruption in her flow. The music continued to grow, not in volume, but in depth. The hall, once filled with scattered attention, now felt united in silence. Even the smallest sounds, like breathing or the faint movement of clothing, seemed to disappear under the weight of the music. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that forms when people do not want to miss a single moment. Somewhere in the middle rows, a person leaned slightly forward again, as if trying to understand what was happening more clearly. Another person rested their hands together, completely still, eyes fixed on the stage. There was no conversation anymore. No distraction. Only listening. She remained unaware of all this outward change. Or perhaps she simply did not allow it to enter her focus. Her connection was with the piano, not the audience. The sound she created was shaped by feeling, not reaction. The melody shifted slightly again. It was still simple, but now it carried a sense of direction. It felt like it was moving somewhere, like it had a purpose unfolding slowly. The transition between notes became smoother, more expressive, yet still controlled. In the audience, a quiet wave of emotion began to spread. Not something visible or loud, but something internal. People were beginning to feel more than just hear. The music was touching something different in each person, but the effect was shared. One person in the front row slowly straightened their posture without realizing it. Another lowered their head slightly, listening more deeply. Even those who had initially been indifferent were now fully absorbed. Backstage, someone paused while walking past the side curtain. They stopped for a moment, listening more carefully. The sound reaching them was not what they had expected from a simple tune. It felt richer, more expressive, as if the piano was speaking in a language that did not need explanation. On stage, she continued without interruption. Her fingers moved across the keys with steady rhythm. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always smooth. There was no sudden change, no dramatic break. Everything flowed naturally, as if the music had already been written inside her and was simply being revealed in real time. The lighting above her remained warm and focused, casting soft reflections on the piano surface. Her hands created small movements of light and shadow as they moved. but she never looked at anything except the instrument. The audience's attention was now complete. No one was looking away. No one was distracted. The performance had quietly taken full control of the room, not through force, but through presence. The melody began to rise slightly in intensity. Still not loud. Still not complex in a technical sense. But emotionally it felt stronger. Each note seemed to carry more meaning than before. It was as if the music had slowly opened another layer of itself. A few people felt something they could not easily describe. It was not excitement in the usual sense. It was more like being drawn into a moment that felt important without knowing why. She continued playing, her expression unchanged. The piano responded beautifully under her control. Even the softer notes now felt full and complete. There was no emptiness in the sound, no break in its flow. It felt continuous, like a single thread weaving through the entire hall. In the silence of the audience, time felt slightly different. Minutes did not feel like minutes. The performance felt both short and long at the same time, as if everyone had stepped into a separate space created by the music itself. She reached a point in the piece where the melody briefly softened again. It was not an ending. It was a pause in feeling, a gentle moment where everything seemed to settle before continuing forward. The audience remained completely still during this moment, holding on to the silence as if even a small sound might break something important. Then, slowly, the music began to build again. Not in a sudden way, but gradually, carefully. Each note added to the next, forming a rising emotional flow. It was no longer just a simple tune being played. It had become something living, something unfolding in real time. The hall remained fully silent. Every person there was now completely engaged, whether they understood music deeply or not. It was no longer about knowledge or expectation. It was about feeling. She continued, still calm, still focused. And as the melody grew once more, the atmosphere in the room shifted again, preparing for something that the audience was not yet ready to fully understand. The hall was no longer the same place it had been at the beginning of the evening. Something had shifted inside it, not in a visible way, but in the way people were feeling, listening, and even breathing. The piano music had taken control of attention so completely that everything else seemed distant now. She continued to play, still seated at the piano with the same calm posture. Her expression had not changed since she began. There was no sign of strain, no visible effort, no dramatic movement. To anyone watching closely, it almost looked like she was simply having a quiet conversation with the instrument in front of her. But what came out of that conversation was anything but ordinary. The melody had now grown into something more powerful than before. It was still built on the same simple foundation, yet it no longer felt simple. The way she shaped each note made it feel larger, deeper, as if it carried emotions that could not be explained with words. In the audience, people were now fully absorbed. No one was shifting in their seats anymore. No one was distracted. Every eye that was open was fixed on the stage. Even those who had not intended to pay attention at the start of the performance were now completely drawn in. A quiet tension filled the room, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that comes when something meaningful is happening and no one wants to miss it. She played on. Her fingers moved with steady control, but now there was a subtle intensity in her motion. It was not fast or forceful. It was controlled emotion, carefully expressed through every note. The piano seemed to respond to her in a way that made the sound feel alive. The melody began to rise again, slowly at first, then with more presence. It was still not loud, but it carried weight now. Each note seemed to build upon the last, creating a feeling of movement that pulled the listener forward. In the audience, people began to feel something they could not easily describe. It was not just appreciation. It was something deeper, something emotional. Some people felt calm, others felt a quiet sense of wonder. A few simply sat still, unable to look away. A man in the back row who had initially leaned back in boredom was now sitting upright, fully focused. A woman near the side gently placed her hands together, not clapping, just holding them as she listened more carefully. Even the small sounds of the hall had almost completely disappeared. The entire room had become quiet in a way that felt natural, not forced. She remained completely centered in her playing. There was no change in her expression, no glance toward the audience, no reaction to the growing attention. She stayed within her own space, where only the music existed. The piano continued to produce clear, rich notes under her hands. Even the softest sounds carried emotion now. It was as if she had found a way to make silence speak through music. The melody began to shift again, gently changing direction. It did not break or stop. It simply moved forward, like a river finding a deeper path. The audience could feel this shift even if they did not understand it technically. Something was changing in the structure of the piece, but it was not confusing. It felt natural, like the music was growing on its own. A few people exchanged brief glances, as if silently acknowledging that they were experiencing something unexpected. But no one spoke. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. Backstage, a few staff members who were passing by stopped completely. They stood still for a moment, listening more closely. The sound coming from the stage was no longer what they had assumed it would be. It had transformed into something far more expressive than a simple performance. On stage, she continued. Her hands moved slightly faster for a brief moment, then slowed again, maintaining perfect control. The rhythm never broke. The flow remained smooth, but the emotional depth of the music had clearly increased. The hall felt different now. Time seemed less noticeable. People were not thinking about how long the performance had been going on. They were only focused on what they were hearing right now. The melody rose again. This time it carried a stronger emotional pull. Still not loud, still not overwhelming, but undeniably powerful. It felt like the music was reaching a point where it was no longer just being played. It was being felt by everyone in the room at the same time. Some people felt a quiet sense of awe. Others felt a calm stillness inside. A few simply watched in silence, unable to move their attention away. She remained steady, her focus unwavering. Her connection with the piano was complete. Every movement of her fingers seemed intentional, yet natural. There was no hesitation, no interruption. Everything flowed as if it had been rehearsed not in practice, but in feeling. The melody reached another peak. Not a loud peak, but an emotional one. It felt like the music had opened fully now, revealing its deepest layer. The simple structure that had started the performance was still there, but it had transformed into something rich and full of expression. In the audience, people felt it strongly now. The earlier assumptions about a simple performance were completely gone. What they were witnessing had moved beyond expectation. A soft stillness filled the entire hall. No one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing felt quieter than before. It was as if the entire audience had become one shared silence, held together by the sound coming from the stage. She continued playing through this moment, still calm, still focused. The music carried forward, not rushing, not stopping, just flowing naturally. Every note felt like it belonged exactly where it was placed. There was no excess, no emptiness, only balance and feeling. The emotional strength of the piece was now fully present. And as she continued, the audience slowly realized something they had not expected at the beginning of the evening. This was no longer just a simple piano tune. It had become a moment they would not forget. The final part of the performance began without anyone clearly realizing it at first. There was no announcement, no signal, no dramatic change in lighting. The music simply continued, flowing from where it had reached, as if it had always been meant to move forward without interruption. She remained seated at the piano, still calm, still composed. Her expression had not changed throughout the entire performance. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, not loud or visible in an obvious way, but steady and deep. It was the kind of focus that made everything around her feel distant. The melody now carried its fullest form. It was no longer just a simple tune. It had grown into something complete, something that felt like it had traveled through different emotions and returned stronger. The earlier softness was still there, but now it was joined by a quiet intensity that gave the music its final shape. In the audience, people were completely still. No one was talking. No one was moving unnecessarily. Even the smallest distractions had disappeared. It was not forced silence. It was natural, as if the room itself had decided to listen without interruption. She played on. Her fingers moved with steady control, guiding the final section of the piece with care. Every note felt intentional yet effortless. There was no sign of struggle, no hesitation. It was as if she had reached a place where the music no longer needed effort, only presence. The melody began to soften again, not fading but settling, like something returning home after a long journey. The energy in the room changed slightly with it. The audience could feel that something was approaching its end, but no one wanted to accept it yet. Some people leaned forward slightly, as if trying to hold onto the sound a little longer. Others simply sat still, eyes fixed on the stage, fully absorbed in the moment. A few closed their eyes, letting the music fill everything they were feeling inside. She continued without pause. The piano responded beautifully under her hands. Even the quietest notes carried depth now. Each sound seemed carefully placed, like it belonged exactly where it was. There was a natural flow in everything she played, as if the music was guiding her rather than the other way around. The melody slowly began its final rise. It was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it had presence. A gentle strength that made the entire hall feel connected to it. Every person there could feel it building, even without knowing music deeply. Backstage, someone stood still near the curtain again. They were no longer moving around or preparing for anything else. Their attention had been completely taken by the sound coming from the stage. On stage, she remained unchanged. Her posture was steady. Her eyes stayed on the keys. Her hands moved with quiet confidence, completing each phrase without rush. There was no need for anything extra. The simplicity of the performance had now become its greatest strength. The melody reached its final shape. It was no longer building. It was settling into its conclusion. A soft emotional weight filled the room, not heavy, but meaningful. It felt like something was coming to rest after being fully expressed. In the audience, people could sense it clearly now. The end was near, but instead of reacting with impatience, they held onto the moment. No one wanted to break the silence. No one wanted to miss the final note. It was as if everyone understood, without needing to speak, that this was something rare. She played the last passage with gentle control. Each note was slightly softer than the last. The energy slowly reduced, not in a sudden way, but in a smooth, natural descent. It felt like the music was gently stepping away, not disappearing. The final phrase approached. Her hands slowed slightly, maintaining perfect timing. The room felt suspended in that moment, as if even time itself had become quieter. The audience was completely focused now, waiting without movement. And then the final note arrived. It was soft, clear, and complete. It did not echo loudly. It did not demand attention. It simply existed for a moment, filling the space with calm presence before slowly fading. She held her hands still on the keys for a brief second after the note ended. There was no movement in the hall. No applause. No sound. Only silence. It was not an empty silence. It was full. Full of everything that had just been experienced. Full of emotion, attention, and quiet realization. She gently lifted her hands from the piano and sat still. Her expression remained calm, unchanged. She did not look for reaction. She did not search for approval. She simply stayed in the moment for a few seconds, as if allowing the music to settle fully before moving away from it. In the audience, people remained still. It was as if no one was ready to break the silence yet. Everyone was holding on to what they had just experienced. The performance had not just been heard. It had been felt. A few seconds passed. Then more. And then, slowly, the silence began to change. A single clap started somewhere in the hall. Then another. And another. It was not immediate applause. It was gradual, building carefully, like people were waking up from a shared moment they did not want to end too quickly. She finally turned slightly toward the audience. Still calm. Still composed. The applause grew stronger. People began to stand. Not all at once, but in waves. One by one, then many at a time. The sound of clapping filled the hall, replacing the silence that had held everyone moments before. She did not react dramatically. She simply acknowledged it quietly. Her presence on stage remained steady, grounded, and calm. The same people who had assumed it would be a simple performance were now fully engaged in appreciation. Their expressions showed surprise, respect, and admiration. What they had expected was completely different from what they had experienced. As the applause continued, she slowly stood from the piano bench. She turned slightly, offering a calm and respectful acknowledgement to the audience. There was no rush in her movement, no need to prove anything. The performance was already complete. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the hall that what they had witnessed was not just a simple piano tune. It was a moment that would stay with them long after the sound had disappeared.